I like that. I'll have to get a t-shirt like that. Coming up, we are going to look at exposure triangle. Hi, Rick here. Welcome to Fun with Photography. Last week we had a look at apertures and how they affect your depth of field. Today we will have a refresher on that, and then we'll be looking at shutter speeds and ISOs, and now all three form the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle. All these, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, all factor in to getting the correct exposure. Aperture, as you remember from last week, the larger the aperture, the more light comes in. The smaller the aperture, the less light comes in. Shutter speeds, the faster the shutter, the less light comes in. The slower the shutter, the more light comes in. And with ISO and your ISO sensitivity, the lower the ISO, the less light, and the higher the ISO, the more light comes in. As we did last week, we looked at apertures. The smaller the aperture, the larger the number. The larger the aperture, the smaller the number. And with exposure, small aperture will have a darker image, and a large aperture will have a brighter image. And depth of field, the smaller the aperture, the more you'll have in focus, and the larger the aperture, the less you'll have in focus. Shutter speeds range from 1/8000th of a second, that's normally in the high-end cameras, and they go all the way down, as you can see here, down to 30-second exposures. If you want a shutter speed longer than 30 seconds, you would go into bulb mode, and in bulb mode you would hold your shutter button down, take the exposure for as long as you require, and then just release the shutter button, and that's how you have it for longer exposures, more than 30 seconds. In saying that, if you held your button down for such a long period and released it, more than likely you would shake the camera. So it'd be a good idea to purchase yourself a shutter release cable, and that way you don't need to touch your camera at all. Or you could put it in timer mode and use a 10-second timer for your exposure, and that should be good enough not to have any movement as well. Right, this refers to moving subjects. This exposure here was taken at 1/250th of a second, and that was fast enough to freeze the action. Here I have 1/60th of a second, it's just starting to blur out a little. 1/30th of a second, 1/15th, and 1/5 of a second. You can see the results there. The slower the shutter speed, the more blurry your image is going to be. As a general rule, to avoid blurred images due to camera shake, if you're shooting up to 100mm, your shutter speed should be 1/100th of a second or greater. If you're shooting at 200mm, your shutter speed should be 1/200th or greater, and at 500mm, 1/500th or greater. The only way to avoid these high shutter speeds is to put your camera on a tripod, and then you can work with lower shutter speeds. This little colourful toy windmill, bought at Sideshow. This one here is taken at a slow shutter speed. All the colours are captured, but it's still blurred out. This one's taken at a faster shutter speed, and it's starting to capture the motion, but it's still blurred out. And this last one here, it has frozen the motion. As you see in this picture here of fire bomber helicopter that were drawing water from our local pond in the park to attend to a fire. I took this photo at 1/500th of a second. That was enough to freeze the motion of the flight, but it wasn't quite fast enough to freeze the motion of the rotors of the blades. In this shot here, it was taken at 1/2000th of a second, a lot faster shutter speed. It's frozen the motion, and it's also frozen the motion of the rotor blades as well. This photo was taken at a faster shutter speed. As you can see, the vehicles are all visible. And in the next shot here, this was taken at a slower shutter speed, probably 2 to 3 seconds, enough to blur out the vehicles. You can't see the vehicles anymore. All you can see is the trail of the lights. If you were to have even a longer shutter speed, so about 10 seconds or something like that, you would get a nice red trail all the way around and a nice white trail all the way around there. In the old days when we used to buy film, on the side of the box there used to be stamped ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, and that was the sensitivity of light for that film, and that's how you changed the ISO in the old days. You'd have to change your film. With ISOs, the lower you set your ISO, the better the quality of the picture is going to be, and the higher you set your ISO, the more noise will be effective and visible in your image. Noise is a grain that's embedded into your photograph, and it doesn't look very well. I'll show you some examples. With ISOs, the effect with a lower ISO, less sensitive to light, but the higher the quality and virtually no noise. And the higher the ISO, the more sensitive to light, but it's lower quality, more noise. This image here, at around the average ISO on most cameras is around about 100. You can see the 18, 19, 20, you can see the words fairly clear, but as you gradually up your ISO, you can see here at ISO 3200, you've lost all detail in the words, and it's become very grainy, and there's also color noise comes into effect as well. Colors do all sorts of silly little things, and the quality is not very good. But saying that, most modern cameras nowadays will go up to ISO 3200, 6400 and still have a reasonably good quality image. Beyond that, I don't think it'd be very workable. Today in camera, all ISOs are adjusted in camera, and it's very usable. You can set low ISO, high ISO, so it becomes very user-friendly. This image here shows a very, very high ISO. It's probably around about the 100,000 mark. As you can see, it's very pixelated. The color, lots of color noise. This has gone beyond what anyone would work with nowadays, but just to show you the effect that ISO noise has in your image. With shutter speeds, every halving or every doubling of light is called one stop. So here you have 1/500th of a second, and if you were to halve that amount by going to a faster shutter speed, 1/1000th of a second, that is one stop of light. And the same applies the other way. If you were going 1/1000th of a second and you're going to double the amount of light going in by slowing the shutter speed down to 1/500th of a second, that's one stop of light. So each of these increments are one stop of light. With ISO, here you have ISO 100. If we want to double the amount of light, we go to ISO 200. That is one stop of light. And the same applies the opposite direction. You got ISO 200, and if you want to halve the amount of light, you drop down to 100 ISO, and that is 1 stop of light. All these increments here are 1 stop of light. So it's a doubling or halving of light is 1 stop. With f-stops, f16, if you want to double the amount of light, your next one would be f11, and then the next one f8. So each one of these increments is 1 stop of light. Now you're thinking, f16, why didn't it go to half f8? Well, there's a formula for that, because of the aperture itself reducing and increasing in size. It works very differently. There is a formula for it, but all you need to do is learn these stops here, your f-stops, and you will know by heart very soon that these are 1 stop of light. On this chart here, all these greens in your f-stops are 1 stop of light. So your f16, f11, f8, they're all going down by 1 stop of light. And this next grid below, you have half stop increments. So you've got f16, if you want to increase by half a stop, it's f13, increase by half a stop, f11. But all the greens are 1 full stop. And down here, it's 1/3 stop increments, f16 increased by 1/3, f14 increased by 1/3, f13, and so on. And the chart down the bottom here is 1/4 stops. So all you need to do is remember these ones here are your full stops of light. This scale here shows an ISO of 50. This is camera settings, ISO 50, 1/1000th of a second at f4. In mid-range, to get the same exposure as that, you could use this, ISO 400, 1/25th of a second at f11. These are all stops of light, each one of these. This one is halving the stop of light all the way down. And with the shutter speed, we're doubling the amount of light all the way down. And with the ISO, we're doubling the amount of sensitivity to the sensor. ISO 3200, 1/15th of a second, f32. That particular setup there I probably would not use, especially going down to f32. You could end up with lens diffraction, but that's something we can talk about in another lesson. At this range, ISO 3200, you're going to have noise in your image, and that's something to consider there. Shutter speed, unless you're down this end 1/15th of a second, unless you're on a tripod, you're going to get shaky hands, you're going to move your lens, and you end up with a blurred image. f32, you'll have everything sharp, but I'd say this one here is the one I would use as an average. ISO 400, not too high, will still be a good result on your camera sensor. 1/25th of a second, good for being handheld, and f11 is a mid-range f-stop. Here we have a little crop of the back screen of a camera. This is in manual mode, and the settings here are 1/250th of a second. We've got f16 and ISO 100, but at those settings, this scale here, which is on the back of most modern cameras nowadays, is your exposure value. If it was in the middle there, that would be correct exposure, but this one here is showing that it's 2 stops. This is in increments of 1/3, so it's showing that it's 2 stops underexposed. So what can we do to fix this up? We can reduce our shutter speed, get a slower shutter speed. So 1 stop, half of 250 is 1/25, half of that would be 1/60th. So we could set this to 1/60th of a second, and then that will move back to 0 and we'll have a correct exposure. But what if we wanted to keep 1/250th? You want to freeze action, so you want to keep 1/250th. What's our next step? We could drop the F stop by 2 stops. So we'll go from F16, one stop to 11, and another stop to F8. So we could set this at F8, and that will give us the correct exposure. But what if we didn't want to do that either? We want to get a nice depth of field. So what's our next step? Then we work on the ISO. We want to increase the ISO by 2 stops, so ISO 200 will be double, and then double again, that will be ISO 400. So we can set this at ISO 400, and that will give us the correct exposure. Next lesson, we are going outdoors. We are going to get down and get dirty. Using our rule of thirds as a guide, we're going to compose our shots from the ground up, and I'm quite looking forward to that. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Bye.